They laughed at him. They mocked him. They told him he was nothing but a farmer's son. But when the truth came out, the whole school realized one thing: never underestimate the power of dignity, hard work, and the right to respect. The halls of Westfield High bustled with life as students streamed through, their polished shoes clicking against the gleaming marble floors. The school was an institution of prestige, a place where wealth and privilege weren't just common, they were expected. Children of doctors, lawyers, tech executives, and real estate moguls filled its classrooms, their designer backpacks slung over their shoulders, their conversations laced with plans for weekend getaways and private club events. But for Adam Carter, stepping into these hallways always felt like walking into another world, a world that had never quite been meant for him. His calloused hands, hardened from early morning farm work, gripped the straps of his worn-out backpack. The fabric of his shirt, though neatly pressed, didn't carry the logo of a luxury brand like those of his classmates. His jeans, though clean, were slightly faded, and his boots, still carrying faint traces of soil from the morning's chores, set him apart like a neon sign flashing "Outsider." As he made his way toward his locker, the subtle but unmistakable whispers followed him. "That's the farmer's kid, right?" a girl murmured to her friend. "Yeah, I heard his family owns some land outside the city. Can you believe he actually wakes up to feed cows before school?" "No way." "That explains the boots." Adam kept his head down, his face an unreadable mask, but their words stung more than he let on. He was used to it, used to being the one who didn't fit the mold of Westfield High. But today, something felt different. He reached his locker and spun the combination, ignoring the smirks of a group of boys leaning against the wall nearby, their collared shirts crisp, their postures exuding the effortless arrogance of wealth. "Hey Carter," one of them drawled, a blonde-haired senior named Ethan Wallace, whose father sat on the school's board. "Where's your tractor parked today? Out back?" A ripple of laughter passed through the group, but Adam refused to react. He had learned long ago that showing anger only gave them what they wanted. Ethan wasn't done. "Man, I don't get it. Why even bother coming here? You know there's an agricultural school like 2 towns over, right? You'd probably be valedictorian there." Another round of laughter. Adam closed his locker a little harder than necessary. He wanted to say something, wanted to tell them that just because he worked on a farm didn't mean he was any less capable, any less intelligent. But what was the point? It wasn't like they'd suddenly start seeing him differently. Before he could turn away, someone else approached. Elena Brooks, one of the few students who never looked at him with the same quiet disdain as the others. "Seriously, Ethan," she said, crossing her arms. "That's the best you've got." Ethan smirked. "Just having some fun, Brooks. No need to get all sensitive." Elena rolled her eyes. "Making fun of someone for working hard? That's not fun. That's just pathetic." Adam shot her a brief glance, a silent thank you, but he didn't linger. He didn't need rescuing, and he sure as hell didn't need to stand around for more of this. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and walked away, feeling the weight of the whispers, the stares, the judgment pressing in. Today felt different, and deep down, he had a bad feeling about what was coming next. The sharp clang of the classroom bell signaled the start of history class, and students hurried into their seats, some still chatting in hushed voices. The room smelled faintly of chalk and old books, the wooden desks worn from years of restless hands carving initials into their surfaces. At the front of the room stood Ms. Catherine Whitmore, her icy blue eyes scanning the class with quiet authority. She was a woman of strict discipline and high expectations, but her standards were not the same for everyone. The students who came from wealthy, influential families, the doctors' kids, the lawyers' sons, the future CEOs, were her favorites, and she never hid it. She praised their answers, encouraged their ambitions, and smiled approvingly when they spoke. But for students like Adam Carter, there was no such encouragement. Adam sat near the middle row, his body tense as he flipped through his notebook, his eyelids heavy from exhaustion. He had been awake since dawn, feeding the animals, repairing a broken fence, and loading supplies onto the farm truck, all before even stepping foot in school. The weight of the morning still clung to him. His arms ached, his head throbbed, and his focus wavered. He knew he should have studied more last night, but after finishing his chores and helping his younger siblings with their homework, his body had given up before his mind could catch up. Ms. Whitmore cleared her throat, drawing the class's attention. "All right, let's begin. Yesterday, we discussed the economic and political factors that led to the Civil War. Who can summarize them for me?" Several hands shot up immediately. Elena Brooks, Ethan Wallace, and a few others. Adam kept his head down, hoping to stay invisible. But he should have known better. Ms. Whitmore's cold gaze landed on him, and a small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "Mr. Carter." Adam stiffened. The room grew quieter, the usual whispers dying down as students turned to watch. Ms. Whitmore took a few slow steps toward his desk, her heels clicking against the tile like a metronome of impending humiliation. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, what were the key factors leading to the Civil War?" Adam's mind scrambled for an answer, but it felt like wading through mud. He had read the chapter. He knew this, but the words weren't coming. Seconds passed. Ms. Whitmore tilted her head, feigning patience, though the glint in her eyes said otherwise. "Come now," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Surely this isn't difficult." Adam's throat felt dry. He hated this game, this deliberate targeting. He swallowed and forced himself to speak. "It had to do with slavery. And, state rights." Ms. Whitmore sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if disappointed. "Mr. Carter, I suppose history isn't something your kind focuses on?" The words hung in the air like a slap. A few students snickered, their laughter muffled behind hands, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Adam's jaw tightened, his nails digging into his palms beneath the desk. Ms. Whitmore wasn't finished. She turned slightly, addressing the class. "You see, history is built by scholars, by thinkers, by those who dedicate themselves to understanding the world. Not by—" She looked back at Adam, her smirk deepening. "Well, not by those who are better suited for plowing fields than learning about them." The laughter came louder this time, sharp, cutting. Adam felt heat rise to his face, but he kept his expression unreadable. He had endured worse, but Ms. Whitmore wasn't done yet. She leaned against her desk, tapping a pen against her palm as if considering something. Then, with a casual cruelty, she added, "Honestly, students like you are better suited for labor than academics." The room fell silent. The laughter stopped. Even the students who had snickered earlier now looked unsure, their amusement fading into unease. Adam could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Ms. Whitmore met his gaze, waiting, expecting him to break, to shrink, to prove her right. But Adam wouldn't give her that satisfaction. He gritted his teeth, forced himself to breathe through the anger boiling inside him, and clenched his fists beneath the desk. His silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And restraint was power. Adam's breath felt heavy in his chest, like a weight pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. Every fiber of his being told him to stay quiet, to endure, to survive like he always had. But today was different. The classroom air felt suffocating, thick with the sting of humiliation. He could still hear the echo of laughter, the snickers that had died down into an eerie silence, as if the entire class was waiting to see what he would do next. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer force of keeping himself in check. Ms. Whitmore's cold, expectant gaze bore into him, her arms folded as if she had already won. Adam slowly rose to his feet, the wooden chair scraping against the tiled floor as he pushed it back. The sound was louder than it should have been, ringing in the silence like a warning bell. He squared his shoulders, forcing himself to meet her gaze head-on. "I work hard," he said, his voice steady but thick with restrained emotion. "That doesn't mean I don't deserve respect." A few students glanced at each other, their amusement now fading into something more uncertain. Ms. Whitmore arched an eyebrow, as if entertained by his resistance. She had expected silence, submission. Instead, he was standing up to her. "Then prove it," she said smoothly, tilting her head. "Otherwise, leave." The challenge hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Adam's chest tightened. Prove it? How? Prove it by playing along? By trying twice as hard just to be treated like everyone else? By letting her words sink into his bones like they were the truth? Number. He wasn't playing her game. His fingers curled around the edge of his notebook, gripping it tightly before he calmly began gathering his things. One by one, he stacked his textbooks, taking his time, making sure that when he left, he would do so on his terms. Ms. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but the flicker of impatience in her eyes betrayed her. The class watched in complete stillness, no one daring to speak. Even the students who had laughed earlier were suddenly aware that this was not the outcome they had expected. Adam straightened, his books tucked under one arm, his free hand clenching into a fist at his side. Then, without another word, he turned toward the door. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, like the weight of every insult, every doubt, every moment of being treated as less than was pressing down on him. But he didn't stop. Not until his fingers wrapped around the door handle. Not until he pulled it open. Not until he stepped out, leaving the room behind in absolute deafening silence. The next morning, Westfield High felt strangely different. Students strolled through the hallways, chatting about their usual topics: weekend plans, test scores, and who was dating whom. But a lingering tension remained from the day before. People had seen what happened in Ms. Whitmore's classroom. The whispers had already started spreading. "Did you hear how she humiliated Adam yesterday?" "Yeah, but he just walked out. Didn't say a word." "You think he'll even come back today?" Ethan Wallace, lounging near his locker with his usual group of friends, smirked as he leaned against the cool metal. "Doubt it. Farm boy probably realized he doesn't belong here." His friends chuckled, nodding in agreement. But before anyone could respond, a low, rhythmic thudding filled the air. It was distant at first, barely noticeable over the morning chatter, but within seconds, it grew louder, then impossible to ignore. The sound rattled the windows, making students pause mid-conversation. Heads turned toward the nearest classroom windows, curious expressions shifting into disbelief. "What the hell is that?" someone muttered. It was then that the first student saw it. A black helicopter, sleek and expensive, was descending onto the school's football field. Within seconds, the usual morning routine at Westfield High erupted into chaos. Students rushed toward the windows, pressing their faces against the glass. Some ran outside, drawn to the rare spectacle unfolding before them. Even the teachers, who normally would have demanded order, stood frozen, watching in shock. A few students pulled out their phones, recording the scene as the aircraft touched down, its powerful blades kicking up dust and grass. The doors of the helicopter swung open, and out stepped a man who commanded attention the moment his polished shoes hit the ground. Henry Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that screamed authority and wealth. Silver hair combed back neatly, his posture exuding an air of quiet confidence. His piercing gaze swept over the crowd that had gathered, his expression unreadable. The students watching murmured in confusion. Who is that? A senator? Some kind of billionaire? Even the teachers seemed uncertain. Then, Adam Carter stepped out behind him. The whispers grew louder. "Wait, is that Adam? No way. That's his grandfather?" Adam walked beside Henry Carter. But today, his posture was different. Gone was the quiet, unsure boy who kept his head down in the hallways. Today, Adam Carter stood tall. The students stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. Ethan Wallace's smirk vanished. "You're telling me the farm kid's grandfather just landed a damn helicopter at our school," he muttered. Nobody answered, because nobody had expected this. The halls of Westfield High had never been this quiet. As Henry Carter walked through the corridors, each measured step echoed against the tiled floor, demanding attention. Teachers peeked from their classrooms. Students whispered in hushed tones, their eyes following the tall, broad-shouldered man moving with undeniable authority. Most people at Westfield High had no idea who he was, but they could tell he was important. The school had seen its share of high-profile visitors, politicians, CEOs, even celebrities during fundraising events. But there was something different about Henry Carter. Maybe it was the calm intensity in his eyes. Maybe it was the tailored charcoal suit that fit him with effortless elegance. Or maybe it was the fact that he had just arrived in a private helicopter, an entrance so grand that even the wealthiest students looked stunned. The air felt charged, thick with anticipation, and Henry Carter was headed straight for Ms. Whitmore's classroom. Inside, Ms. Whitmore stood by her desk, flipping through papers. Though her hands were stiff, her movements unusually rigid. She had heard the commotion outside. She knew something, or someone, was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The classroom door swung open, and Henry Carter stepped inside. The effect was instantaneous. The students froze. Even those who had no idea what was happening could feel it. The shift in power, the weight of authority that Henry carried effortlessly. Adam walked in behind him, and for the first time, he wasn't the one being scrutinized. All eyes were on Henry. Ms. Whitmore's lips parted slightly, the first real flicker of uncertainty crossing her usually composed face. "Mr. Carter," she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I wasn't expecting—" Henry lifted a hand slightly, stopping her mid-sentence. "I hear there was an issue with my grandson." His voice was deep, steady, unwavering. A statement, not a question. A few students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, sensing something monumental was about to unfold. Ms. Whitmore straightened, attempting to regain control. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, I treat all of my students equally. Adam simply... Henry tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his coat pocket. The room held its breath. He pulled out a check. Not just any check. A donation slip made out to Westfield High, the ink still crisp. Ms. Whitmore's expression faltered. Henry tapped the check lightly against his palm before speaking. This school receives funding from the Carter Foundation. The silence in the room deepened. I built the very science lab you take pride in. His voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, razor sharp. I sponsor the history program you oversee. A murmur ran through the students. A few turned to one another, the realization sinking in. Ms. Whitmore's face was draining of color. Henry took a step closer, his presence towering over her. Yet you saw fit to humiliate my grandson over his background. A single heavy beat of silence followed, and for the first time, Ms. Whitmore had nothing to say. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. The weight of Henry Carter's words pressed down on every person present, suffocating Ms. Whitmore under the gravity of what had just happened. She stood stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The usual sharpness in her gaze had dulled, replaced with something else. Discomfort, uncertainty, shame. Henry Carter, still holding the check in his hand, studied her reaction carefully. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to argue or demand anything. His presence alone commanded attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but cutting, his words razor sharp. I raised Adam to understand that hard work is honorable, he said, taking a measured step forward. Maybe you should learn that before looking down on those who put food on your table. A ripple of unease spread through the students. Some exchanged uncertain glances, processing the moment. Others simply stared at Ms. Whitmore, watching her face as the realization dawned on her. She had mocked a boy for his background, a boy whose family wasn't just some small-time farm owners, but one of the most influential forces in agriculture. Her authority in this room, something she had wielded with ease for years, felt suddenly hollow. Adam, who had remained silent through most of this, watching everything unfold, finally stepped forward. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one being looked down on. This time, he was being seen. And for the first time, he had something to say. His voice, steady but firm, broke the silence. I don't want special treatment, he said, looking directly at Ms. Whitmore. I just want the same respect as anyone else. The statement wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be dramatic. But it struck deeper than anything else spoken that day. The truth was simple. All he had ever wanted was to be treated as an equal. Not pitied, not mocked, not underestimated. For the first time, Ms. Whitmore had no clever remark, no dismissal, no smirk. Instead, she swallowed, and after a long moment, she exhaled shakily. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft, uncertain even. I understand, she said, her gaze flickering between Adam and Henry. Her shoulders stiffened as if the words pained her, but they came nonetheless. I apologize, Adam. A few students in the back shifted in their seats, still processing what they had just witnessed. The unshakable, unflinching Ms. Whitmore, apologizing. Henry Carter simply gave a knowing smirk, tucking the check back into his coat. His message had been delivered loud and clear. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the class, landing on each and every student. Respect isn't given, he said, his voice filled with certainty. It's earned. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew one thing for sure. Henry Carter had just taught the most important lesson Ms. Whitmore's class would ever learn. The rest of the school day passed in a blur, but something about Westfield High felt different. The whispers in the hallways had shifted. Before, when students spoke about Adam Carter, it had always been with mockery, with quiet judgment, with the assumption that he didn't belong. But now their voices carried something else. Respect. No one said it out loud, but they all knew what had happened that morning. The sight of a black helicopter landing on the football field, the arrival of Henry Carter, the way Ms. Whitmore had been forced to face the truth about her own prejudice, and most importantly, they had seen Adam stand his ground. That was what stuck with them. Not the money, not the power, but the way he refused to be small in a world that tried to shrink him. As the final bell rang, Adam gathered his things. He could still feel the eyes of his classmates on him, but for the first time, it didn't bother him. As he stepped into the hallway, a familiar voice called his name. Hey, Carter. Adam turned. It was Ethan Wallace. For a split second, Adam braced himself for another remark, another jab about his boots, his background, but it never came. Instead, Ethan just nodded once. Not mockingly, not begrudgingly, just a simple, silent acknowledgement, and then he walked away. Adam exhaled slowly. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. This was enough. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the parking lot, and waiting near the curb, beside a sleek black car, stood Henry Carter. Adam walked toward him, his footsteps steady, his chest feeling lighter than it had in days. Henry studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching his grandson's face. Then, without a word, he placed a firm hand on Adam's shoulder. "You proved something today." Adam looked up at him, waiting. Henry's voice was calm, steady. "Not just to them," he said, "but to yourself." A slow smile tugged at the corners of Adam's lips. For so long, he had measured himself by their standards, their expectations, their judgments, their idea of what success looked like. But now, he knew better. He wasn't just a farmer's son, he was his own person. And as he walked away from school that day, he held his head high. Because dignity wasn't measured by wealth or privilege, it was measured by self-respect.